Hello everybody, Resonance here, and today I'll be giving you all my impressions on the new African Kingdoms metagame. Age of Empires 2 HD Edition on Steam has so far received 2 expansion packs that brought with them a long list of new civilizations, units, technologies, and balance changes. The focus of this video is going to be on the 4 new African Kingdom civilizations, the Berbers, the Ethiopians, the Malians, and the Portuguese. If you're looking for more detailed information on each of those civs, I have civ overview videos in the video description below. I'll also be talking a bit about water balance as well as the siege tower unit and the 2 new technologies, Arson and Arrow Slits. There are going to be some topics that I will leave out in this video, but if there's enough demand for it, I'd be happy to do a follow-up where I talk about things like the state of the older civilizations and anything else that I didn't get a chance to cover. Last but not least, I do livestream regularly on Twitch TV, and you can find my livestream schedule on my Twitch page by scrolling underneath the video player there. If you're looking for more Age of Empires 2 content as well as videos for other games, then you're in the right place. Alright, so without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the Berbers. So after playing a lot with the Berbers, I would say that the most notable thing about that civilization is definitely going to be that their stable units cost 20% less starting in the Castle Age. It's important to note though that this bonus does not apply in the Feudal Age, which means the Berbers do not get any sort of crazy powerful scout rush. However, once they get to the Castle Age, they get an insanely powerful Night Rush, and I think this is basically what defines the Berbers as a civilization, and it's what really just keeps them afloat in general. For every 4 knights that your opponent has, the Berbers get to have 5, and if you've been playing a lot of online Age of Empires 2, you've probably noticed that the metagame generally, revolves very heavily around this Night Rush strategy. We'll usually see, when players are in the pocket position, as in they're not adjacent to an enemy, they're instead surrounded by their teammates. A fast Castle Age in Knights is generally going to be one of the more optimal plays. For starters, you can fast Castle Age in the pocket, relatively safely because you're far away from your opponent, so you're less likely to get rushed and punished for that. Then once you get to the Castle Age, you can start fielding out Knights. Knights happen to be fast enough that you'll be able to defend your flanks and get to the enemy fast enough, so it's a lot better than going for like a fast Castle Age and a long swordsman, which are just too slow. And Knights also happen to be incredibly difficult to counter if your opponents are still in the Feudal Age, like while both flanks are fighting each other, so the Age of Empires 2 metagame generally revolves very heavily around the Night Rush. It's a threat that you have to deal with on a lot of land maps, and the Berber civilization has one of the strongest Night Rushes in the entire game, and it really allows them to snowball the entire situation and close games out before they even get to the Imperial Age. And I think that's very important because the Berbers as a civilization really start to drop off once they hit the Imperial Age, and this is because they're missing some really key technologies such as the upgrade to Paladins. So while the Berbers can get to the Imperial Age and then upgrade their inevitably larger army of knights into cavaliers, if the game goes on too long, the Berbers are starting to run out of viable options, and their cavaliers, while cheaper, won't be able to match it favorably. Still though, there are a lot of other aspects of the Berbers that do keep them interesting as a civilization, despite their powerful Night Rush. So now that I've talked a little bit about the Berbers cavalry bonus, let's talk a little bit about their 2 unique units, the Camel Archer, which you can create at the castle, and the Geniteur, which they can create at the archer range. The first one I'm going to talk a little bit more about is the Geniteur, and it's particularly interesting because the Geniteur, as part of their team bonus, is available to everybody on the Berbers player's team, so everyone can make it from the archer range. So it's not just for the Berbers. Having a Berbers on your team gives you a ridiculous amount of utility. The Geniteur is a mounted skirmisher type unit, and for those of you who were playing around with the scenario editor as a kid, you may have noticed that there was a similar, exactly the same name unit, Geniteur in the scenario editor. It was a militia that threw javelins at people. I believe it was the beta unique unit for the Spanish, but it was changed to the Conquistador later in development. We have the Geniteur now, and I would say that this unit was incredibly strong on release, and it's been nerfed a lot since then. As a unit right now, I think that it's definitely viable, and it's a pretty significant advantage to have a Berbers on your team if the game goes on too long, as we'll be able to go field out all those Geniteurs. But I don't think it's OP necessarily. There are a couple interesting things about the Geniteur though that I think might need to be changed. For starters, if we look at the Geniteur as a unit, it has some pretty bizarre Castle Age combat stats. So, it has an attack of 4, which is actually pretty high, which means that you can almost do some sort of fast Castle Age Geniteur rating. It's not actually completely terrible. It obviously performs very poorly against things like Knights, but yeah, it's a very, very strong answer to crossbowmen, and they have enough attack damage that, unlike elite skirmishers, the Geniteur is possible to raid with. If I could change the Geniteur, I would honestly take 1 attack damage off them in the Castle Age. It's not like I think a Geniteur rush is too strong, but I would take 1 attack off them in exchange for giving them 1 more range. Why? Because you know what's fun? Being able to have this sort of Berber army where everything is mounted. And one thing that's really awkward is if you're going for Cavalry Archer Rush, which is certainly a lot more viable in African Kingdoms because, you know, now Cavalry Archers cost 10 less gold than they did in the base 1.0 C game. That's a lot. If you're going for Cavalry Archers and you wanted to mix in some Genitours to ensure that you can beat down your opponent's ranged army, it's really difficult and weird to micro them because the Genitours have one less range. So I would like to see them with perhaps one less attack damage and then one more range. That way they maintain the same level of utility. You know, I feel like they should be a counter unit rather than something that you just kind of rush out and raid with. And I like the idea of being able to mix those in with your Cavalry Archers and Camel Archers. Overall, I don't think that the Genitor is necessarily too strong, but I would like to see those stats shuffled around just a little bit. That way, players will be more encouraged to experiment with some sort of mounted army style of play. Now, what about the Camel Archer? That's going to be the Berbers' second unique unit and the one that they create at the castle. It's a very interesting unique unit and one of my favorite ones in the game. It's a Cavalry Archer with an attack bonus versus other Cavalry Archers. Now, if you're looking at it as purely a counter unit, then it's obviously going to be very niche in its application. A Camel Archer having an attack bonus versus other Cavalry Archers isn't generally going to come into play that much, but still in the Age of Empires 2 metagame, the Camel Archer will be an incredibly powerful and effective answer to the prevalent elite Mangudai that the Mongols love to go for. So the Camel Archer is going to be a great answer to that. And should Cavalry Archers ever pick up some play, because you know they cost 10 less gold now, which is only 60 gold, which is pretty reasonably priced. So if Cavalry Archers ever pick up in play, or perhaps your opponent is massing things like Elite War Wagons or the Indian Elephant Archers, definitely the Camel Archer might see some play as a counter unit, but really I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I would consider the Camel Archer, since his combat stats are good enough, to just be a unit that you can put in at the back of your army, a good solid range support unit to back things up. The Camel Archer has pretty strong combat stats, nothing nearly as good as the Elite Mangudai though, because the Elite Mangudai has a very, very high attack speed, whereas the Camel Archer does not. But still, overall, I consider the Camel Archer to be a decent range support unit. One thing I wanted to note though about it is the upgrade Maghrabi camels that the Berbers get in the Imperial Age, and this makes your heavy camels and your Camel Archers regenerate HP over time. This upgrade is incredibly weak, and it's one that I actually had a lot of, I thought it had a lot of potential, I guess. It's something I was very excited for. I love the idea of having an army of Camel Archers just regenerate HP. Because if there's any unit in the game that can leverage an HP regeneration bonus the best, it's going to be Cavalry Archers, because you can micro them so easily, and once you pull out of a fight, they'll just be able to heal up, and then you get a lot of extra value from those Camel Archers. I had very high hopes for this bonus, but it turns out that the HP regeneration bonus is so very slow. So very slow. I think I mentioned this in the Berber Civ overview, but I believe it's like 1 HP every 4 seconds, which is substantially slower than the Viking Berserker HP regeneration bonus. I understand why it's this way, because again, we don't want, our Highlander Camel Archers that they're regenerating so much HP. This bonus very, very, very rarely comes into play. Heavy camels not known for their natural bulk. They don't last very long, so you're not really going to get that much out of this bonus. Same thing with the Camel Archers. It's decent. At least the bonus is very reasonably priced. It's rather cheap, so you don't really feel like you're wasting that many resources on it. I feel like if we're going to give a buff to the Berbers, it might as well be maybe a small improvement to the Maghrabi Camel's regeneration rate. It's a little bit slow. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that the Berbers' Night Rush is basically what keeps them relevant as a civilization. Although I do think that that bonus is actually just too strong. So if I was going to make changes to the Berbers, what I would do is I would nerf their stable bonus so that stable units cost 15% less starting in the Castle Age, and then in the Imperial Age, it scales back up to the regular 20%, and this is because the Berbers really drop off in the Imperial Age. Now, why exactly do the Berbers drop off in the Imperial Age? More importantly, it's because they lack technology such as ring archer armor, and this is a really, really weird thing, in that the Berbers' Genitours, since they don't have ring archer armor, are actually going to be worse than a lot of other civilizations' Genitours. I don't think it's necessarily correct that the Berbers should have the strongest ones. I think it's okay if, for example, a civilization like the Turks, with their unique technology, Sipahi, that makes their Cavalry Archers have plus 20 HP, makes their Genitours better, that's fine. But when I look at something like, the Italians, for example, imagine the Condottiero were just missing a lot of blacksmith upgrades. It would feel really, really weird. So I think the Berbers should have ring archer armor as just a baseline. I think that the Berbers, since the Genitor is their unit, they should be able to actually utilize it. And not having ring archer armor is a massive loss, and it also makes their Camel Archer unit a lot weaker in the Imperial Age too. It's actually The Berbers as a civilization, they're missing things like paladins, ring archer armor. They don't have Parthian tactics, but I guess I think that's fine. No halberdier. I understand that's because they have heavy camels. Overall, the Berbers are just missing out on a lot of techs. They're missing out on siege onagers, siege ram. They don't have bombard towers. These type of things make the Berbers a lot weaker as the game drags on. I don't think that they are a weak civ in general, but out of all the African Kingdom civilizations, I would consider the Berbers to be the weakest of the bunch, and maybe with just a couple minor changes, I think they would be in a great position. So, to reiterate, I think the stable bonus should be staggered a little bit because the Berber Night Rush is incredibly strong and perhaps way too strong. So I think you could stagger that bonus 15% in the Castle Age, 20% in Imperial Age. Give them ring archer armor, that way their elite geniteurs feel a lot better. Maybe they can use heavy cavalry archers now, their hand cannoneers feel better, camel archers feel a lot better. I think it's something that's very necessary for the civs. And I'd also like to see the geniture stats shuffled around a little bit, so that way it has the same range as a cavalry archer. That way perhaps you open up some play for a mixed mounted army comp like that, and that way you're more incentivized to use them as a counter unit rather than just as a raiding unit. Alright, so let's move on then. Now, I'm not going to spend as much time talking about the other civilizations compared to the Berbers. I just had a lot to talk about there because they had, 2 unique units and just a bunch of things at play. Overall, I think the Berbers are a good civilization, but they're a little bit weaker than all the other African kingdoms ones. Moving on to the Ethiopians. This civilization is more balanced than I thought it would be, honestly. I think that this is a civilization that is often incorrectly considered to be absolutely broken, and what they're most known for is definitely the Ethiopian Shota Warrior Rush. The Shota Warrior is very strong. It's a solid raiding unit in the Castle Age, and in the Imperial Age it can be a massive threat. Now, I don't think that this unit is actually too strong necessarily, maybe only a little bit, and that's because it's very, very cost inefficient. The Shota Warrior costs enough food and gold so that, the fact that they have such low HP and no armor whatsoever, they die really easily. It can be very inefficient if you end up losing an army of them. And I think the reason that people see Shota Warriors as so strong is because players are just not used to playing against this type of unit. They're not used to defending against it. The castles and keeps mow them down. Any sort of ranged unit can take care of the Shota Warrior very, very easily. And if the Ethiopians keep throwing them away, and especially considering that they don't really have an economy bonus that applies throughout the entire game, then they're going to be wasting a lot of money, and that's definitely going to weaken them substantially. What I think pushes the Shota Warrior over the edge is probably going to be the fact that you can get a big group of them, run them underneath players' town centers, and just blow up those buildings instantly. I think that they perhaps do a little bit too much damage to buildings. So I think there are 2 ways to deal with this Ethiopians problem right now. One is we can take away Arson from them, and I'll talk a little bit about this more later on the video, but Arson is that new technology that they gave all civilizations in African kingdoms. That gives their infantry +2 attack versus buildings. I think if you take that away from the Ethiopians, that balances them out tremendously, and that would fix a lot of these issues. Either that, or I would just take away the Shota Warrior's attack bonus versus buildings. I think that when it comes to unit versus unit combat, this unit will end up in a lot of situations where it's inefficient, and I like when players have to think a little bit more carefully about when they want to use it. And the real problem, I think, is when they just run in there and rather than kill all your villagers, they just blow up all your town centers and castles without really enough time for your opponent to react. So I think those can be nerfed just a little bit, but overall I would say that the Ethiopians are just something that players will have to experiment with more, and in time people will become more comfortable defending against them. I'm also interested to see if there's any, exactly how powerful their receiving 100 gold and 100 food and advancing the next age bonus actually is. I haven't seen too many crazy, super fast Castle Age into Night Rushes that have actually worked out, because you end up sacrificing a lot of your economy if you abuse that bonus to advance really, really quickly. So I'd like to see where things go from there. Maybe there's, a lot of strategies that we haven't seen yet. One last thing is that this is something that Zero Empires ended up covering in one of his videos on his channel, which I'd be happy to put in the video description below. The Ethiopians have a very strong tech called torsion engines, which makes their siege workshop units blast radius larger. This makes them very strong. In the Imperial Age, we're always looking at a strong siege line, so I definitely like that. I would say, though, that it's a little weird that the Heavy Scorpion and Scorpions don't actually benefit from torsion engines much at all. The increased blast radius doesn't actually seem to make them damage more units in any way. So I would like to see that maybe slightly adjusted just for the Scorpion, because I think that's somewhat of a strange interaction. So overall, I would say the Ethiopians are just a little bit too strong, and if we can weaken the Shota Warriors' damage versus buildings a little bit, I think they'll be in a great balanced spot. Alright, so on to the Malians. Now, this is a civilization that I think most people have considered to be the strongest one added in African kingdoms. I always ask that people reserve their judgment because these are new civilizations and it'll take a long time of playing with them before we know how strong they really are. Still though, I'll say that after beta testing the Malians and playing this many games with them, that they are definitely too strong, and I think the strongest civilization added in African Kingdoms, and I think they could use maybe more sizable nerfs than the other civilizations that I've discussed. So for starters, why are the Malians so good? It's because their buildings cost 15% wood bonus actually applies to farms too. This is something I didn't really consider at first, but it's almost power creep the Teutons out of the game entirely. The Malians' economy is crazy with the free gold mining upgrades combined with the buildings cost 15% less wood. Those two bonuses in conjunction are really strong. So if I was going to nerf the Malians, I would make it so the buildings cost 15% less wood bonus does not apply to farms. A small change like that I think would bring the Malian economy in line with everyone else, and it would balance out the fact that their military is also crazy good. And why is their military so good? It's because, well, their barracks units get +1 pierce armor per age starting in the feudal age. I think this bonus is way too strong. There are a couple ways to balance it, and like one suggestion that I've seen a lot is why doesn't this bonus just apply in the Castle Age? Well, I think the reason why we haven't seen it only apply in the Castle Age is because the developers are trying to encourage a more men-at-arms style play from the Malians, and I think that's fine. I think it's interesting. I'm okay if the Malians in the feudal age are making men-at-arms and spearmen. I don't think that's where they are OP. I think the real problem is that in the Imperial Age, the Malian champions and halberdiers, they're way too tanky. You know, they're like Huskarls, but like they have like insanely strong combat stats. They're like Huskarls, but you don't have to be the Goths. You get all the plus sides of not being the Goths. Like you get Stonewalls, for example. You have a strong economy. It's far too much. I think they have way too much armor. So how exactly would I balance out this bonus? And I think that there are a lot of options here. The one that I like the most, perhaps, is staggering this bonus so that it only applies once in the feudal age, once in the Castle Age, and then not again in the Imperial Age. This means that they're going to have one less pierce armor overall than they do right now. I was considering just suggesting taking away plate mail armor, because that would have a similar effect and it would be a little bit easier for players to understand. However, we haven't actually had a civ in Age of Empires 2 yet that is missing both blast furnace and plate mail armor, so maybe that sort of goes against the design philosophy of the game, so I'd be happy to just make it so this bonus applies only in the feudal age and only in the Castle Age. That way we get to see men-at-arms play, longswordsmen play, their champions and halberdiers will still be really good but not overbearing. Another way that I've seen players suggest as a way to deal with this is to just take away their halberdier upgrade. And I'm not sure exactly how I feel about it. I think that one of the things that makes the Malians feel unique and interesting is that their trash line, the units that don't cost gold, so the light cavalry, elite skirmisher, and the halberdier are all pretty good. They're already missing bracers, so I don't think that their trash line is that strong, and while their light cavalry are very, very good because of the Farimba bonus, they still don't have hussars, so I don't think it pushes them over the edge that they have halberdiers. I think the real problem in general is that their units just have too much pierce armor, so if you take away one pierce armor, I think that they end up turning out just fine. Removing something like halberdier kind of feels bad. At least they have heavy camels to deal with this, and I suppose that it would be a nerf that I would accept, but I'd prefer we just take away one pierce armor in general, because I still think that even their champions themselves are a little bit too tanky. Overall, the Malians are a very strong civilization. I think the strongest one added so far. I have sort of mixed opinions on the Gabito unique unit. Maybe it could use like a 1 attack reduction, but I don't think that I would go too far on nerfing the Gabito. It's a unit that is also very cost inefficient if you happen to lose a lot of them, and it's a unit that I think that I haven't been playing around with enough, because where it really excels is as a support unit to sort of back up your siege line, right? So you can have Gabitos, and then you have your powerful onagers and whatnot at the back, and the Gabitos can sort of protect them. I don't know if they're necessarily too strong, maybe just a little bit. I would go with something small, because I feel like if you take away too much of their stats, then they might just feel really, really weak. Because as a unit, I think that the Gabito is still definitely answerable, and while it's kind of power creeped out the elite throwing axemen, so maybe throwing axemen could use a little bit of love. I don't think it's necessarily that the Gabito themselves are too hard to answer, so maybe a little bit too strong. They could perhaps go with a 1 attack nerf, but I don't think it's anything overbearing. They're still so very easy to kill. Yes, the Portuguese. So this is a civilization that I also think is very strong, perhaps a little bit too strong, but maybe it's not necessarily apparent as to why at first. For starters, all their bonuses are very good, like the units cost 15% less gold, means that their monk rush is very strong, their knight rush is very strong, so overall as an economy bonus, it's pretty solid, but the real thing that makes the Portuguese ridiculously difficult to deal with is arquebus. I think the sleeper technology of African kingdoms. This technology is absolutely crazy. Gunpowder units being affected by ballistics is way better than I thought it would be. I think that I made the mistake that a lot of players made, where I was just thinking is like, oh, hand cannoneers not missing as much, that sounds pretty good. But really the strength lies in the fact that bombard cannons don't miss, making them so good against enemy bombard cannons, siege weapons like onagers. The fact that bombard cannon shots can be dodged is something that really balances them out. We saw that a lot in, you know, that arena game that I casted recently, that 1v1 expert arena game, where we saw the two Persian players dancing back and forth, dodging the bombard cannon shots. Against the Portuguese, that's just not going to happen. They don't miss. So their bombard cannons are crazy, and their bombard towers as well. Bombard towers is also very easy to dodge those shots, and since bombard towers land like all the time now, then that makes them really good. And it's important to note as well that the fact that the Portuguese bombard towers, not only do they benefit from ballistics, but the Portuguese as a civilization have this unique building called the Feitoria, which they can build in the Imperial Age, and that allows them to spam bombard towers like nobody's business. Probably my least favorite addition in African Kingdoms is going to be the Feitoria. And this is for a number of reasons. For one, the Feitoria, as we've seen in Spirit of the Laws video, and if you just do the math yourself, you'll realize that the Feitoria, which generates resources over time for you, but it costs 20 population, is actually an incredibly inefficient investment most of the time. In general, you're just going to want to have those 20 villagers rather than spending that 20 population on the Feitoria itself. The resources that it generates for you, it just come out pretty slowly. But that's not the correct way to look at the Feitoria, I think, in that it's a very problematic building to balance because it's bad like 90% of the time, but in those small fringe cases where it's actually good, this building is insanely game-breaking. So first off, if we talk about 500 population games or anything, you know, higher than 200 population, some players do play on those settings, and I think it's unfortunate that the Feitoria is so broken in those types of games. When population is less of a big deal and you're just able to build them casually, then you can take advantage of that infinite gold and stone. And it's also important to note that in a long, drawn-out 1v1, having a Feitoria is a colossal advantage, an infinite source of gold and stone that really can't be dealt with. I think the original strength of the Feitoria was supposed to be in that you're trading away some efficiency to turn your villagers into a building that is really difficult for your opponent to raid or deal with. So the Portuguese economy in that sense becomes sort of untouchable, but less efficient. And I think that was supposed to be an interesting trade-off, but it's not really used that way. It doesn't generate enough food and wood, for example, to make up for the fact that you're going to be missing some villagers. So even though the Portuguese economy, if you convert them all to Feitorias, is untouchable, it's crappy, so no one wants to touch it. I think the problem with this is the infinite stone. I feel like the Feitoria should be generating more gold, more food, and wood by a little bit, and then just less stone. Because really what's really frustrating to deal with in the late game is if the Portuguese, if you're on a higher population setting or the games are dragging on too long, they're just spamming bombard towers left and right, and their arquebus bombard towers are too good. And they don't miss their shots, and it's very frustrating to deal with. I don't like that the Feitoria is like a feast or famine building that is only good in a small number of situations, and when it's good, it's super oppressive, and when it's bad, it's really bad. So I would like to see the Feitoria tweaked a little bit. Obviously, some other way to deal with this would just be to limit the amount of Feitorias that people can have, and besides my suggestion to buff the other resource generation and nerf the stone to hopefully make it a little bit better overall, I think honestly the best way to balance the Feitoria is just to limit players to like 1 to 3. But the reason that we haven't seen that, and then of course, if you're limiting it from 1 to 3, we would buff the resource regeneration quite a bit, so it's somewhere closer to the amount that villagers would produce. If by limiting it, it's just a lot less abusable, I think the reason that we haven't seen a limit on the Feitoria yet is because it sort of goes against the Age of Empires 2 original development philosophy, and I think it's something that the current developers feel a little bit weird messing with. One of the things that I like about Age of Empires 2 is it's a game with very few restrictions. I can have as many castles as I want, as many towers, I can build things wherever I want, and if the Feitoria had a cap on how many you could have, like 1 to 3, it would be the first time in Age of Empires 2 where we've had a building where the developers are like, no, you can only have 3. So that sort of goes against the feel of Age of Empires 2, but I think for a building like this, either every civilization should have the Feitoria, or, well, maybe no one should have the Feitoria at all. And if the Portuguese are going to keep it, then I think the best solution would still be to do something a little bit different and make it so that they're, you're restricted to like 1 to 3, and then perhaps we can lower the requirements a little bit for it, maybe buff the efficiency of it. Or, I guess the band-aid fix would be to nerf the stone generation a bit and then buff the gold, food, and wood by just a smidgen. So overall, I would say that the Portuguese as a civilization are very strong, but so are all the other African Kingdom civilizations, and I'm not sure if Arquebus necessarily needs a nerf, but it's something that I've got my eyes on as it's very, very good. And really, I think that the Feitoria is the thing that needs the most tweaking for the Portuguese, so I look forward to seeing where the developers go in terms of Feitoria changes. Now, obviously, the focus of this video so far has been mostly on land combat. And that's because I didn't want to make the video much longer than it needed to be. Like, for example, I haven't really covered the Portuguese unique ship, the Caravel, and I haven't really talked that much about the Berbers as a civilization on the water. So I'm going to try and make the water balance section a little quick. It's something that the water balance has been changed so much in African Kingdoms with the addition of the Fire Galley and the Demo Raft ships in the Feudal Age that I think it's going to take a very long time of playing with all of these new changes to really know how strong each of these civilizations are and how the new ships actually fare. So it's something like with the rest of the topics that I didn't get a chance to cover in this video. I'd be happy to revisit it at a later date if there's any demand for it. There is one thing that I will say about water balance right now, and I really think it's that the Aztecs need demolition rafts and demolition ships and maybe heavy demos too, just to remain competitive and viable in the current African Kingdoms water metagame. Nothing feels quite as bad in African Kingdoms as playing on a water map and then randoming the Aztecs, because if we look at their tech tree, the Aztecs are missing so many crucial water map upgrades. No access to Galleon is devastating, they're missing both demolition ships, but in general in the 1.0C balance, that was actually not that big of a deal. Believe it or not, the Aztecs used to be at least passable on the water because their 15% faster military creation speed applies to galleys as well. So even though their galleys drop off significantly in strength as the game drags on, at least the Aztecs were able to have a larger group of galleys, and it used to be that water combat was almost entirely decided in the Feudal Age, and that's when the Aztecs were on a relatively even, if not advantageous footing. If the game dragged on too long, the Aztecs started to really fall far behind, but before that, they were doing alright. Now in African Kingdoms, with the addition of the Demolition Raft, Fire Galley, and the buffs to the fire ship line, for example, the Aztecs are not looking so strong. Water combat can go on for quite a while, and it's not just decided by mass galley micro, and the fact that the Aztecs don't get access to demolition rafts and demolition ships means that they're very, very weak in the Feudal Age. Or at least I should say they feel weak, and this is because fire galleys have found themselves as a relatively dominant part of the water map metagame, and the best answer to fire galleys is probably going to be a small number of demolition rafts, which the Aztecs just don't have that benefit of being able to do. So while your opponents are able to make demolition rafts, you can't, and that feels absolutely terrible to play on the water. And since the Aztecs are just less dominant in general because, you know, they've already lost their free loom, I think that it would be very fair to just give them access to demolition rafts and demolition ships to sort of bring them up to speed and make them feel at least decent on the water. It's also important to note that another reason why the Aztecs are at least used to be pretty good on the water is because of their strong villagers being able to carry extra resources. This is just a good economic bonus in general. So yeah, give them demolition rafts and demolition ships and I would say they are fine. Overall, in regards to water balance, I would say that I was actually mostly okay with the 1.0C water balance. I think that maybe fire ships could have been a little bit stronger, but I mean like just a little bit. I have no problem with these epic Feudal Age galley micro fights. Sure, it was repetitive, you know, every civ is basically the same on the water besides their economy bonuses. There wasn't really that much that actually differentiated them, and perhaps there's something that could be changed, but really I would say that I wasn't opposed to the 1.0C water balance. I thought the galley micro was very, very skill intensive, and on some level I would honestly rather watch players carefully micro and control their galleys rather than see them just use fire galleys and demo rafts, or at least in the fire galley case it's a lot less exciting to see someone micro them and it's a lot less skill intensive. So on one hand I sort of miss the old water balance, but what I can say is that even though I'm not exactly sure where water balance stands right now yet, and it's something that we're gonna have to play a lot around with, and I would encourage people not to jump to too many conclusions, keep an open mind, it'll take a while before we know. All I can say is that right now, water balance feels very different, and since galleys are no longer, the mono galleys are no longer the dominant choice in the Feudal Age, and perhaps even in the Castle Age as well, the Aztecs fall a little bit short. Really, I think the main problem with water combat right now is that civilizations just don't feel like they're differentiated between very well, and perhaps that could be addressed by giving every civilization on the water their own unique ship, but that's a tall order. I don't expect that to ever actually get implemented. I can only imagine how much work that would actually be. Now onto the siege tower itself, so let's jump a little bit back onto land units. I'm not going to go that much into detail in the siege tower because I've already been talking for a long time, and I've already done a video specifically dedicated to the siege tower as a unit, so you can find a link to that in the video description if you want to learn a little bit more about the siege tower, how it works, when it's good, and what I would, I guess, do to make it a little bit better. So let me just cut straight to the chase. The siege tower right now is pretty bad, and a huge part of this is because the unit is just simply way too expensive. I don't like how niche the unit actually is in this application due to a number of things. I feel like, for one, the unit is very, very buggy, and the fact that it can only go over one layer of walls is somewhat problematic. It's just far too expensive for what it does, so I would like to see the siege tower getting a small price reduction, and then perhaps it might be more usable. And last but not least, we have the two new technologies that were added in African Kingdoms that every civilization, both new and old, actually have access to, so this is for everybody. And the first one I'm going to be talking about is Arson, which every civilization can research at the barracks starting in the Castle Age. For a modestly priced 150 food and 50 gold, you can give all of your infantry units +2 attack versus buildings. The point of this upgrade, and the reason why it's offered for such a cheap price in the Castle Age, is because the developers are trying to make infantry units more usable in general, particularly in the Castle Age, because if we go back to the standard 1.0 C balance that we all grew up with, the Long Swordsman never really saw that much play outside of some fringe cases where it's a pretty good counter unit to things like Eagle Warriors or Huskarls. In general, though, the Long Swordsman tragically underused, and Men-at-Arms have only been picking up a little bit in play recently, so Arson is designed to encourage civilizations with a reasonably good infantry line to experiment with them in the Castle Age and give them a little bit of something besides raw stats. I think combined with the Long Swordsman getting an additional 5 HP, that Arson might actually be enough to make the infantry line a little bit more usable. It's interesting because with some Long Swordsman with Arson, which is something that is absolutely affordable, you can put a lot of pressure on your opponent's economy, not necessarily by killing their villagers, because the Long Swordsman as a unit is very, very slow, but you can, threaten to blow up some of their buildings, and perhaps their makeshift defenses with palisades and houses will actually not be enough to keep the Long Swordsman out. Still, though, it remains to be seen as to whether or not Arson is enough to make the infantry line viable in the Castle Age, and we'll have to see. I think the real problem with Arson, though, is that the technology perhaps could have been a little bit stronger, but the reason that it's not is because every civilization gets access to it, and I really wonder if some civilizations should have Arson for balance reasons. I was talking a little bit about this earlier on in the video, but the Ethiopians with Arson is a little bit ridiculous. They're just able to run in there and blow up your town centers with little to no effort, and I also feel like it's something that pushes the Goths a little bit over the edge too. Combined with the Goths bonus where their infantry units have +1 attack versus buildings, I feel like that stacking with Arson is maybe a little bit too much, and perhaps the Goths Huskarl Flood, which is very oppressive to play against if you don't have specific civilizations with good champions, maybe it's a little bit too much. So you could probably buff the Goths infantry bonus to maybe like +2 attack and then take away Arson, something like that. Although I don't think it's necessarily problematic that every civ has Arson, it just might actually restrict design space a little bit, having to balance Arson between all the civilizations. Overall, it's a weird technology. I kind of like it, and we'll have to see if it's good enough to make Long Swordsmen usable for most civilizations. At least for something like the Malians, I think Long Swordsmen are a real, viable option in some situations. And finally, we're on to Arrow Slits. Now, Arrow Slits is a very cheap technology that players get access to in the university at the Castle Age, so all civilizations have this tech as well. Arrow Slits is very cheap, so it costs 300 wood and 200 food currently, which is definitely affordable. And what it does is it gives you +2 attack for your watchtowers, +4 for your guard towers, and +6 for keeps. So it's not a flat bonus. The bonus goes up as you upgrade your towers. And the whole point of this technology was again to incentivize players to use underutilized units and buildings, in this case, keeps. In the classic 1.0 C Age of Empires 2 balance, we basically never saw keeps or guard towers used, even when players had already gone for a tower rush. Like watchtowers are used defensively in the Feudal Age to protect your resources and offensively to pressure your opponent's resources in the Feudal Age. But we almost never saw players research guard tower or keep. They just weren't really efficient upgrades. Units just scaled in strength so much better than the guard tower and keep upgrade could keep up with. Like, the extra 1 attack that you get per upgrade was definitely not enough. And Arrow Slits being affordable, which is important because keep is actually fairly expensive in itself, and it giving this much attack is enough that keeps actually feel pretty good. I've been playing around this technology a lot. I'm still not sure how practical keeps are, but I really, really like how this encourages me to experiment. I feel like I have more options, and I still might not be building too many keeps, but this technology feels balanced, it's fun, and it has some disgustingly good synergy with the Japanese, because the Japanese get the Isama technology, which makes it so their towers fire 3 arrows instead of 1, so they're getting a lot more value out of this bonus than every other civilization is. I think one of the reasons as well, besides the tower upgrades being very expensive that we don't see them that much, is that stone's a pretty precious resource, and would you rather have a couple of keeps or a castle? I think most people would go with the castle. And why build keeps when you have bombard towers? The stone can also be used for stone walls. Still though, with arrow slits, keeps are an option. It's something that I look forward to experimenting with, and I don't actually think that they're that bad now. This is a fun upgrade, and I like it. This video turned out to be a lot longer than I thought it would originally be, but I had a lot to say, and there's still plenty more on balance that I have to cover in case I do any follow-up videos on this. As always, I'm open to discussing balance, of course, during my live streams or just in general in other videos, so if you want to hear a little bit more about my thoughts on African Kingdoms, then you're in the right place. Overall, I would say that African Kingdoms actually feels pretty balanced. I think that all 4 of the new civilizations are perhaps a little bit too strong, but only by a little bit. I think that it's often over-exaggerated how good these guys actually are, and that with enough experience, when players get used to countering and dealing with all the new things that they added in African Kingdoms, that we'll find that these civilizations are a lot more balanced than they actually appear. And I'd rather them be a little bit too strong than a little bit weak. That way we can encourage players to experiment. There aren't too many failures in African Kingdoms. Perhaps the siege tower was just pretty bad and could have used a significant price reduction and maybe even a rework as a unit. Overall, I'm very happy with the state of balance in African Kingdoms, and I look forward to exploring it more in the future. There are just so many changes here, so it's difficult to actually know the impact of each of them right now, and I'm very, very satisfied with it. I think that it's overall pretty close to balance. So if we nerf a couple of things here and there for some of the newer civilizations, give the Aztecs a little bit of love on the water, for example, buff the siege tower, then African Kingdoms is going to be in a very, very strong spot. Of course, it's also important to keep in mind that African Kingdoms came out relatively recently, and we're going to see balance changes at some point in the future. Development is nowhere near over, so you can expect within maybe a month or two that we get some sort of balance changes and perhaps more along the lines in the future until we get African Kingdoms to an ideal spot. So yes, keep your eyes peeled. I know I will be, and as always, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you're looking for more African Kingdoms videos, I'll have links to those in the video description below, as well as links to my Twitch TV page and social media. If you enjoyed watching this video, then please leave a like rating below, as well as a comment. As always, I appreciate the support, and I look forward to reading what you think of the current state of African Kingdoms balance, as well as what you thought of this video. I also do read all the comments, even if I don't get a chance to respond to each of them individually. Overall, I've had a blast playing all of the new African Kingdoms content, and I think the developers did a tremendously good job of keeping things fresh, while still maintaining the feel of Age of Empires 2. And so, on that note, thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.